You good? I had a couple of verses I was thinking about discussing today. I'm going to go through the verses and give you guys a real clean translation into English, and then I'll explore some ideas I had about them and we can discuss them a bit. These two verses take place at the end of the 16th chapter of the Gita. And Krishna says, Ya Shastra Vidhim Utsrijya. One who rejects or gives up or casts aside the rules of the Shastra. The word Shastra in Sanskrit refers to really a religious text. It comes from the Sanskrit root shush, which means to rule. And so a Shastra is a book that rules or that governs people's behavior. That's a Shastra. You can ask them to be quiet? Okay, also ask them to be quiet. Thank you, Shriji. So the word Shastra in Sanskrit refers to a text that governs society. Now there's a pretty popular idea in the US and in most countries these days that there should be a separation of church and state. Do you guys understand what that means? The separation of church and state? If you weren't born in the US, you might not know what this means. But if you were born in the US, it's a pretty common idea. There should be a separation of church, that's religion, and state. State here means the government of a country or a state. Chill out. All right, here we go. There should be a separation of the religion and the government. It used to be that everything was ruled by religion. Like if you look at the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, it's a bunch of rules for how to govern society. If you kill a slave, then how much you have to pay for that slave you killed, and which crops you're allowed to plant side by side, how people are punished if they don't obey rules of chastity. If you look at the 600 plus rules and mitzvahs listed in portions of the Hebrew Bible like Exodus and Deuteronomy, they're rules for how society should be governed, and oftentimes they're punishments, legal punishments. And if you looked at when the Jews were in power, they would enforce these rules, and it's how they governed. Did you guys follow that? Now, the Christian New Testament doesn't really have these type of rules for how to govern. But the Christians just ended up going back to the Old Testament when they wanted to find these rules. So it wasn't like the Christians were devoid of rules to govern society. The New Testament was, you could say, an appendix, or I want to say an appendage. It's a footnote to a new chapter of the Jewish revelation. And so the portions of the New Testament that contrast to the Old Testament, those portions superseded the Old Testament. But then when it came down to governing and having rules, it's like really tough to get off the ground with all you guys coming in late. It's like my mind doesn't. I have to go over things again and again and again. I'm just going to start again. Here's the verse. Yas Shastra Vidim Utsrijya. rejecting the rules of the Shastra, the scripture. And the word Shastra comes from the Sanskrit dhatu, or verbal root, shush, which means you guys should shush so I can make my points. Shush means to rule, and so a Shastra is a book that rules or governs. Now that sounds a lot like a legal text. And in general, we would translate Shastra as religious text. But that is a poor translation because Shastras were legal texts in India. For instance, there's a book called the Manu Samhita. You guys know that book? The actual name for that book is the Manava Dharma Shastra. That's the proper name of the book. The Dharma Shastra of Manu is called the Manava Dharma Shastra. It was a Shastra about Dharma, and if you look at the work of Manu, if you look at the other Dharma Shastras, a whole body of Indian texts called Dharma Shastras. And they were legal texts that were used in ancient India to govern society. They prescribe crimes and punishments for crimes, and they are just like any other legal text you would find ruling a group of people where you had to follow those rules, otherwise the military and essentially armed people would punish you. When you look at our legal codes in this country, if you don't follow them, eventually a group of armed people will come and find you and they will punish you for not following our rules. That's the way it works. So when you talk about a legal text or a legal code or laws, what you really mean is rules that people set up, and if you don't follow them, you will be compelled to follow them or you will be punished for not following them. And you'll be punished by force, whether you accept it or not. Do you guys follow this? Like sometimes you'll see people driving on the road and they've determined that they don't require a driver's license to drive on the road because they're sovereign citizens, and when the U.S. was first formed, the Constitution didn't have any rules for licenses to be required to drive on the road, and they get pulled over by the police and they'll say, I'm a sovereign citizen, I don't require a license. And they'll be yelling, I'm a sovereign citizen, and as the police are pulling them out of the window of the car and handcuffing them. Or sometimes I've seen people on the beach, they say, I'm Jesus Christ, don't touch me, while the police are throwing them to the ground and handcuffing them. And so when you write a legal text, what you're really doing is you're saying, these are the rules, and we're going to compel you to follow these rules, whether you accept them or not. You don't get to opt out. There's a philosophy behind this. It's called social contract theory. Essentially, that any civilization, any government, gives you certain things without you asking for them, such as roads and schools and medical care in most countries. You don't have to ask for this. It's just automatically given to you. There's roads. You just walk outside and there's all these nice roads. You didn't have to plan them or build them. You just get to use them. There's a police force, a fire department. Also, it's just there. And then there's other stuff that's just there, such as laws and taxes, that you have absolutely no choice over. And by taking birth in the U.S. or standing in the U.S., you have to follow the rules of the U.S. You get the rights of being in the U.S., and you have to follow the rules of being in the U.S., and you don't have a right, you don't get to question either one. Certain things are taken away from you, and certain things are given to you, and you don't have a choice in the matter. That's called social contract theory. It's the way governments run. John Locke, he kind of framed this out, 17th century. He explained all this, and actually became, in a lot of ways, the precursor to the Constitution of the United States. This very, very much informed the Constitution of the United States. It was written, whatever it was, 100 years later. I believe Locke was in the 17th century. So when it says Shastra here, rejecting the rules of the Shastra, in a modern day we would say rejecting religious texts. But really it means rejecting texts that govern you. And it used to be there was no separation of church and state. And so if you look at the Torah, it's a bunch of rules and punishments. What you have to do, what happens if you don't do it. The Gentiles have their own set of rules, and then the Jews have their set of rules, and when they come into power, they enforce some of these upon the non-Jewish people as well. The Christians, the Christian revelation, didn't really try to update or change Jewish law. It added Jesus to the mix and added this thing of, like redeeming people and stuff like that. So those things would supersede the old Jewish law. But then when it came to governing, you find Christians in the Middle Ages who were ruling, going back to the Hebrew Torah to find the rules for how to govern society, because they wanted to govern society theocratically. Like democratically, they wanted to govern society theocratically. It was a theocracy. The whole world was run as a theocracy before. They were religious texts. Those religious texts were also legal texts, and that governed society. Do you guys follow this? If you look at Islam, Islam really is Sharia. Islam is Sharia. The first day of the Islamic calendar is the day that Muhammad conquered Medina and established Sharia law in Medina. It's not the day Muhammad was born. It's not the first day he got something from Allah. But the first day of the Islamic calendar is the day that Muhammad fought, defeated the people who were living in Medina, and then established rule over them and made them follow Sharia. In Islam, Dar al-Harb, or a house of war, is a place where Sharia is not followed. Dar al-Salam is a place where Sharia is followed. A house of peace is a place where Sharia is established. A house of war is a place where Sharia is not established. So when Islam was ruling India, India was Dar al-Salam. Hey, shh. India was, I see you. Shh. Thank you. And so when the Muslims were ruling India, India was Dar al-Salam, was a house of peace. 90% of the population wasn't Muslim, but the Muslims ruled and made everybody follow Sharia. And then if you look at Turkey, Turkey is, the whole population is Muslims. I mean, there's a few Christians there, but for the most part, 90% of the population is Muslim. But despite the vast majority of people in Turkey being Muslim, because it has a secular form of government, then Islam considers Turkey to be a house of war, because Sharia is not enforced on the people. You guys follow this? So Islam was a form of government. It's a little more complicated than that. You didn't have to follow Sharia exactly if you weren't a Muslim. You were a dhimmi. A dhimmi was a protected person. You had to pay a jizya, or a tax. Sometimes you got your hands tattooed to show that you were beneath the Muslim rulers, the Sultanate, the Caliphate. You were beneath the Muslim rulers, but you were allowed to practice your own religion to some extent. But you were kind of like a second-class citizen. Similar to how in South Africa, if you were black or Indian, you had less rights. White people enjoyed a certain level of rights, and then Indian people enjoyed lesser rights, and then black people enjoyed even less rights in South Africa during apartheid. And so people who followed Sharia and were Muslims, they had the most rights. And people who did not follow Sharia but paid the tax and accepted their dhimmi, their being under the Muslims, then they had some rights. And then the people who did not accept that were infidels. If you accepted the rule of the Muslims, for instance, you didn't have to follow Ramadan, for instance. You didn't have to go on the Hajj. You didn't have to pay the zakat, which is the Muslim mandated charity. But you had to pay a jizya, which was a non-Muslim donation you had to make, tax you had to pay to not practice Islam. And so you had not quite the same rights, but you had some rights. You were considered to be protected under Sharia. They had a way of figuring this out because they realized they couldn't make everybody follow their religion. So they had a second-class citizen if you accepted the rule of the Muslims, but you yourself weren't a Muslim. So when you look at Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and you notice that Christianity followed Judaism, you see the whole world was ruled by religious texts, which were also legal texts, and there was no separation of church and state. That's why it was such an important deal when they said, we're going to separate church and state. Because prior to that time, it wasn't like that. Church and state were one. Do you guys follow this? So really, Yashastra Vidim Utsridya, rejecting the scripture, Vartate Kama Karaka, and moving to do whatever you want to do, to act according to your desire. Karmakar. To do by desire. To do what you desire. Vartate, you turn towards that, towards just fulfilling your own desires instead of being ruled by law. Nasa siddhim avapnoti. You won't achieve, he won't achieve perfection. Na sukham, nor happiness. Na param gatim, nor the supreme goal. If one rejects the rule of the scripture and instead acts according to their whim, they won't achieve perfection, nor happiness, nor the supreme destination. He who disregards scriptural injunctions and acts according to his own whims attains neither perfection, nor happiness, nor the supreme destination. It's a super literal translation Prabhupada offers. Tasmat shastram paramamte. Therefore, you should follow the evidence of the scripture. Karya akarya vyavyastitao. In determining what is to be done and what is not to be done, you should follow the Shastra to determine what is to be done and what is not to be done. Yatva Shastra vidanuktam karma kartum ihar asi. And then, having known the rules of the Shastra that are declared in the Shastra, knowing the rules that are declared in the Shastra, then you should act in this world. Karma kartum ihar hasi. You are able to act in this world having understood the rules of the scripture and using them as your evidence for determining what is to be done and what is not to be done. And if you reject those rules and you instead act according to your whim, you won't achieve perfection, nor happiness, nor the supreme destination. Do you guys follow that? Later on, at the end of the 17th chapter, Krishna says, Ashradaya hutadatam tapas taptam kritam chayat asad iti uchate parta nachata pretya na iha. Anything offered without faith and any austerity performed without faith is called unreal and bad, and it doesn't benefit you in this life or the next. So there's a place for faith. It's also there. So that criticizing people who don't have faith or belief is there. But a very heavy criticism is leveled towards people who don't follow the rules of law as ordained in our scriptures. And this idea flies in the face of the very concept of separating church and state. Did you guys follow that? This idea in the Gita, just like you have like slavery in the Hebrew Bible and slavery in Islam, in the Quran. And when you look at that, you're like, ooh, these guys are really outdated. And you have, animal sacrifice. Ultimately, Jesus was the animal who was sacrificed. Normally, you would sacrifice a lamb for your sins over the year, and that was the paschal sacrifice. You follow? You would sacrifice a lamb. And Jesus became the Lamb of God that was sacrificed on behalf of the sins of all of mankind. That's the idea. And that was Passover. So Passover was done every year by the Jews on a micro level. But then Passover and an animal sacrifice was done for the whole world. And Jesus was that sacrificial animal. So it's a super archaic sacrificial cult idea. blood sacrifice idea. It's also based on the idea that you can punish somebody for somebody else's sins. It used to be if you had a slave and you were punished, you could have your slave go and be beaten or whipped for you. That was legal. And so Jesus being killed for us, it partakes in this idea that punishment can be transferred to another individual, something which is totally illegal in this country. It's also based on the idea that you can pass on your debts. It used to be that the son would inherit the debts of his father. That's illegal now. You can't pass on your debts. If you die in debt, you can't pass it on to your children. You can pass on your assets, and they would have to accept your assets along with your debts. But if they determine that your debts and your assets don't equal out and they end up upside down, they can just let go of the whole thing, and your debts die with you. You can't pass on your debts to your children. That's why it's a mortgage. It's a death payment. That word mort in mortgage is mortuis. It's a death payment. You have to pay it until you die. So, if you look at Jesus, there's this old idea that you can pass on your debts to somebody else. There's this old idea that there's a blood sacrifice, an animal sacrifice. There's this old idea that, slavery is okay. And similar in Islam, they have a bunch of, backwards, outdated ideas. It would seem that Krishna here is also espousing outdated ideas. Shh. You, man. Shh. It would seem here that Krishna is also espousing outdated ideas. You follow? I wanted to defend this against critique. I wanted to defend Krishna's ideas against critique and try to demonstrate that they aren't outdated ideas, like slavery and punishing somebody else and passing on your debts. Although on the surface, at first glance, it might appear that Krishna has an outdated mode of thinking here, and we've superseded this with a better way of ruling. I want to try to argue that we haven't, and this is still very much in play. Do you guys follow? That's what I was setting it up. All right. I don't believe we've ever separated church and state. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equally and are endowed by their Creator. So they're created, and they have a Creator, and that Creator has given them certain inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You guys paying attention? That's a religious decree. The Constitution starts out with a religious decree. You don't have to leave. You can stay. It's okay. Just try to keep him quiet. Try. He wants to go. Okay. You can go in the back, as you like. Did you follow this? The Constitution of the U.S. starts out free. Because there's actually no way to establish law without appealing to a natural order, a divine order, and basic, inalienable rights of a given people. You might not say it's from the Torah, or it's from the Bible, or it's from the Dharma Shastras, or it's from the Quran. You might not do that. You might get to it some other way. But there is no way to set up laws without saying, we feel that this represents the basic, inalienable, fundamental rights that God gave to all creatures, or that are naturally endowed in all creatures by the universe. You have to use some religious language, that there is ultimately some divine order. You're not just making it up. It's not like we just decided we're going to do this and it doesn't really matter, and there's, we just arbitrarily made these decisions and there's no real rhyme or reason behind them. You don't do that. You must appeal to some higher principle. It can be logic and reason. It can be predecessors. It can be something which was voted on by the people. You can figure out whatever way you want to. You have to get to some higher principle that then allows you to say, and everybody here has to follow these rules, whether you accept them or not. Interestingly, The Constitution does not begin saying, we the people have determined that these are the natural rights of man. We do say we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. We do say that in the preamble. We the people. You follow? So there is an acknowledgement that we're deciding this. We, our group, is making these rules. But while making the rules, they didn't say, and these are just the rules we've decided upon. They chose a different language. All men are created equally, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They made a reference to a higher axiom that transcended we the people and what we decide. And they were looking for a natural order of things, a natural higher principle. And they were saying, we're establishing these rules, and these rules are for everybody. That's a religious decree. It's made without referencing the Bible. It's made without referencing the Torah or the Dharma Shastras. But it's ultimately trying to set up a Shastra, a governing text, which has authority because it represents the fundamental nature of reality. Did you follow this? There is no way to transcend your sensual desires and your feeble mind with its whimsical attitudes without aligning yourself with and lashing yourself to and making yourself submissive to a higher principle which goes above the up and down roller coaster that is someone's senses and mind. People have all sorts of competing desires that morph and change on a day-to-day basis. And if you allow yourself to be governed by those, the people around you who depend on you, the people that you cohabitate with, are in immense danger at every step. Because you can do anything. Because desire ultimately guides all of your actions. And you justify things simply because you feel like doing it. And those feelings can change, and they certainly don't remain static and stable. And so what people need to do if they want any kind of stability in their life is they have to set up rules for richer or poorer, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. Until the day you die, do you accept this person? That's marriage. We have contracts, which means it doesn't matter how you feel. You're obliged. You have no choice in the matter anymore. That's why you sign the contract. You join the military. You can't just go, I don't want to be here anymore. Sorry, you sign on the dotted line. You can either serve in the military or we'll put you in prison for the rest of your time. You're supposed to be in the military. It used to be deserting the military was punishable by death. That was the general rule. If you leave your post and you desert the military, then your own military that you serve will now kill you. As we try to establish some semblance of uniformity and fairness and justice and rule and law and order, there is no way to do so without putting forward the idea that we've discovered the truth. We've discovered the natural rights of man. We've discovered the inalienable rights of man. We've discovered what ultimately is the higher principle that governs all the lower principles. And we're going to write it down. And once we write it down, everybody has to follow it. Therefore, there's nothing wrong with having a Shastra that rules people religiously. There's nothing wrong with having a Shastra that rules people legally. There's theoretically nothing wrong with having a text which is both religious as well as legal. I don't see any inherent reason. If a legal text can rule people, and that's like punishing them and sending them to prison for life, and even executing them. You follow? And there's a religion which governs people's behavior. I don't see any reason why those two things couldn't be the same. I don't see any reason why, if they have authority independently, or if this one has authority, why it couldn't be joined to this one. In fact, you find serious legal texts ultimately referring to a creator, to universal law, to an ultimate principle of existence that governs all lower principles. That's God. That's what all religious texts do. Where it gets dicey and dangerous is when those quote-unquote scriptures arbitrarily just decree things without any rhyme or reason, and they propound awful ideas that don't stand up to any scrutiny. That's where you're in trouble. When under the umbrella or under the aegis, under the authority of representing God, people make awful laws and rules, and just simply on the strength of this written down in a book, then everybody has to follow it, and it doesn't even make any sense. That's the problem. You could write down atheistic codes that people voted on. For instance, like the Nazi Party was the party of Germany. It won. It was like that everybody agreed, let's be Nazis. So just because everybody agreed to it. Can you tell them to be quiet? Quick, move, man. Just because a bunch of people agree to something doesn't make it right or reasonable. And so the danger isn't that religious texts were used to govern people. The danger isn't that non-religious texts are used to govern people. The danger is when you have poorly reasoned ideas being written down and then blindly followed. That's my argument. Krishna's statement here might chafe a little bit. It might, on the surface, run against the popularized versions of ideas about separation of church and state that you would have drunk with your mother's breast milk if you took birth in the U.S. or in most quote-unquote civilized countries of the world. It might offend at first glance and appear to be backwards or represent an older teaching. And certainly religions oftentimes are filled with old, unreasonable ideas. But in this case, if you just dig in a little bit, you'll find that nothing's changed. Currently, in the U.S., in a country that supposedly has a separation of church and state, we still are ruling by divine order. And everybody, all 350 million of us, have to follow it in this country. Do you guys follow that? And so I think rather than worrying about whether something has a religious origin or not, what's better to do is to look at the information contained within that, whether it's reasonable, whether it's defensible, whether it stands up to some scrutiny. That's a better use of your time. We cry separation of church and state, but the state oftentimes comes up with awful ideas. And we have to fight huge wars with states that came to horrible conclusions. And sometimes you might find a religious text which has brilliant ideas. Brilliant ideas, which should be followed by people. Which would make the world so much of a better place. I think the Muslims had it right when they had, people could be dhimmis or they could practice Sharia. I think they had it wrong when they made those people automatically second-class citizens. I think they were wrong in many of the ideas in their text. I think many of the ideas about the nature of the world were wrong and don't stand up to scrutiny. But the basic idea that as long as your religious text is broad enough, that it grants rights to all people irrespective of their religious persuasion. That it protects their right to believe what they want to believe. If those ideas come from a religious text, no problem. Give credit where credit's due. But what I think we did was we borrowed from the religions of old when we constructed our Constitution and our legal code. We borrowed from old religious ideas and we just didn't credit them. We were plagiarists. And we thought that just because we X their name off of the stuff we came to, that means somehow or other we'd fully separated church and state. But we actually didn't. We just represented religious ideas that had been codified thousands of years before, and then just took away the author's names and claimed it as our own. Therefore, my argument is that our separation of church and state is a facade. It's not actually true. There's no way to govern your own life, and there's no way to govern a group of people without having some ultimate arbiter that makes determinations. And that ultimate arbiter should never be just because we agreed to it, even though it makes no sense. Like a gang could agree to go murder their rival gang for no reason. And they could all unanimously agree. That doesn't make it okay. And so, whenever you want to come up with something which has staying power, you have to find, hey, go out and don't come back in. Close the door. And tell them to close the door. Keep it closed. Sorry, man. Your kids. Kids are the kids. They just happen to be yours. It could be mine. They just happen to be yours. I love you, so I'll chastise your kids just like they're my own. If you want to come up with a set of rules that aren't just whimsical and nonsensical, you have to appeal. These are the fundamental rules. These are the principles of reality. This is what the Creator determined. This is the natural order of things. This is the rights of man. The rights of man was the immediate precursor to the U.S. Constitution. The rights of man. And when you look at like the Republic, that was like a much earlier text. That goes back to Plato, which tries to determine how to govern. You look at all these ancient texts, they're really trying to discover the rights of man. It's not just God decreed and therefore let it be so. It's kind of a simplistic understanding of how ancient religious texts with their rules were written down. And so we shouldn't hate on ultimate principles. We shouldn't hate on ultimate causal principles. And we shouldn't hate that that's like ultimately what we're trying to touch when we're coming up with a legalist text. What we should fault is when it's merely because your text says it, that you get to enforce that upon somebody else, even if it doesn't make any sense. And we should force a group of people and their religious text and everything else to measure up to some standard of logic and reason. And so I think our separation of church and state is a little bit kitschy. It's a little bit hypocritical. It's a little bit of a facade. It's a little bit of a charade. And I read something like this: one who discards the rules of Scripture, one who just disregards higher principles that govern your life no matter how you feel, and instead just does whatever they want. That person won't achieve perfection or happiness or the supreme destination because they're just wandering around, wallowing through this world, doing whatever feels good. Therefore, you should use Shastra, you should use higher principles to govern as evidence for what you should and shouldn't do in determining what should and shouldn't be done. Karya vyavastita. And then once you've done that, yatva shastram vidhanoktam, once you've understood what these higher principles are, then karma kartum yarasi. Then you're able to act in this world definitively and surgically. You're able to navigate this world, glide through this world without just floundering. We have to learn to obey some higher principle, some higher truth, to pull us out of just being like animals that just do whatever feels good. Animals run on instinct. The basic distinction between us and animals is that we don't merely run on instinct. We can reason through stuff. That's why we have these massive brains. All right, so I want to lay out this text, which appears to be archaic, and it seems to be similar to many other ideas in old religion that I don't like. And I wanted to defend it and point out that there is actually a logic behind it. And it is still in effect, and it is still how things are governed. Okay. We still got a few minutes left. We can leave the cameras rolling. Any feedback for me? Yeah. Loud. Scream at me. Like literally scream at me at the top of your lungs.
For me, it's...
That is not screaming. I mean scream at me, please. Otherwise I can't take your question because I have to repeat everything you say.
For me, it was very educational because I never...
You actually didn't change your volume at all. For me, it was very educational, so you're just going to make me, because you think I'm your servant, right? So you just want me, just like you're the big man and I'm like the small man who screams what his master says, right?
I never knew the difference between, what's the separation between church and a state. And so thank you for...
You heard this idea, right?
Yeah.
You've been in the U.S. long enough where you've heard this, right? It's like an axiom. It's an unquestioned principle that we say, oh, you have to separate church and state. And any country that doesn't do that is just the worst country in the world, right? You've heard that many times, right? It's like a fundamental rule that you have to follow, even to breathe in this country. And if you don't, you're deemed to be just a backwards, right? Okay, keep going.
So how you say that even though they say there is separation of church and state, but they still use the God-given rules, like, all men are created equal. So thank you for bringing that up there.
It's an artificial separation of church and state. What they really should have said is, we don't want to be beholden to any particular sectarian religion. And we want to be able to align ourselves with brilliant ideas wherever they might have appeared throughout history. And we're looking to get down and dial in the essential rights of all human beings. And we want to reflect those essential rights that come from some higher power above all of us. And we want to arrive at those rights, and then we want to preserve them for ourselves and posterity's sake. And so really we're separating ourselves from Christian dogma, from this idea of ruling by divine right. They were really trying to break free from the ruling by divine right, which is how kings justified that them and then their progeny got to rule over everything because they were born in that family. And it was a seminal line. It was just based on that. They wanted freedom. In a lot of ways it was anti-casteist. There's a beautiful verse in the Mahabharata that says, if you find a Shudra and he has the qualifications of a Brahmana, call him a Brahmana. And if you find a Brahmana and he has the qualities of a Shudra, call him a Shudra. Trying to break free from an empty seminal lineage which is passed on to unqualified people just because they were born in the right family. They're trying to get around their own version of that existed a couple hundred years ago in this country, which is where the British ruled everything by divine decree, and they were able to tax us without giving us any representation. And so they revolted against that. But it's just become almost like this universal maxim of a separation of church and state. And I just can't see any logical reason why a religion might not have gotten it right and come up with a good law book. Okay. More feedback. Yell at me.
It absolutely is a facade, because I mean, when you get to the legal aspects of things, there's every bill in God we trust, right? I mean, it's been there from the beginning, and it is the predominating factor. So the facade is absolutely there. So help me God, right? These are all words that are
put your hand on the Bible.
In legal, yes.
One nation under God. It's all over the place. Now you can get rid of all of those accoutrements. You can get rid of all that language. You can secularize all that language. And if you go to a country like France or Denmark or wherever, you'll find they've done that. They've gotten rid of all that God language. And there's a big movement in the U.S. to do the same thing, and it will eventually happen. What you can't get rid of is the principle that we're saying we've discovered universal truth, fundamental truth, truth that's true in all places and all times for all peoples. And we're saying that that is going to govern. That's going to govern things. You can't get around that. And so you might be able to get free to some extent from some of that religious language. But the principle of we're aligning ourselves with a higher truth, and then we're saying that's going to govern everybody, which is a religious claim, which is a religious idea, that you can't get away from. One more. Yell at me.
Thank you for another great class, Prabhu. If I live in a country that is established on certain religious principles or God-given rights and guidelines, but I have no faith.
Yeah, I got you. So here's my advice. We took birth in this country. We should all follow the rules of this country. And fortunately, in the country that we happen to have taken birth in, our right to practice any religion is given to us. And religions, for the most part, have undergone a transformation. Islam is a notable exception. But religions have mostly undergone a pretty serious transformation where they've moved from methods of governing people to methods of personal transformation. It used to be that religions tried to get the government and rule, and that was the game. That changed in various places at various times, but for the most part, around the world today, religion has become defined as a personal way of communing with God that can then exist within any legal structure. And usually you'll find in most religions a statement that you should follow the rules as they've been established and then practice your religion privately. And we happen to live in a country where we can do that to a large extent. And so we should accept that this is where we're born, follow the rules of the land, which by and large are reasonable and fair, and practice our spirituality as a method of personal transformation. At one point, Prabhupada was offered a meeting with Indira Gandhi. This was in the 70s. I don't know how familiar you guys are with Indian political history, but Indira Gandhi was really heavy. She was really heavy. She forced people to get sterilized. Tens of millions of people in India, there was a forced sterilization campaign. You know this? Yeah. Yeah. It went all through the 70s. No, it wasn't the 80s. It was the 70s. The 70s. They forced people to get sterilized. They would round people up and castrate them. Not like cut them, but chemically castrate them. So they were in sterile. I guess castration is the wrong thing. They would sterilize them so they couldn't procreate as a method of population control. And Indira Gandhi was ultimately assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards. But she ruled India, and at one point she was losing control of the country, and she offered to meet Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada refused to go and meet her. He said for a sadhu to go and meet a king is inappropriate. She must come to meet me. So he refused. This is like a thing in India. Like you have to set the mood proper. It was like a power move Prabhupada made. I'm like, she has to come and meet me. Because the scriptures say a sannyasi should not go to meet a politician. Ultimately, she refused. But he sent his devotees to go meet her. And he gave them a list. And he says, if you want to not lose your country, here's what you need to do. And one of the things on the list, because Prabhupada was starting to think about what rules he should put together, he said you have to outlaw public meat eating. You have to outlaw public meat eating. Like, if you go to Vrindavan now, not Mathura, but Vrindavan proper, the town of Vrindavan, there is no public meat eating in Vrindavan. People eat meat in Vrindavan. There are Muslims who live there who eat meat, but they do not sell meat openly on the street. They carry covered baskets around in the early morning, and they go to different houses and deliver meat, and then those people will cook meat and eat meat, but they do not publicly display it. There are no, although Muslims are living there, and normally there would be butcher shops where they were slaughtering animals in the open air butcher shops every day, where they slaughter animals and then sell them before they go rotten at the end of the day, because they don't have extensive refrigeration. I mean, they do. They have refrigeration all over Vrindavan, but anyway, that's the old school market, which is still extant all over India. If you drive to the Muslim part of town, you'll see open air butcher shops. They're killing animals, like the Wuhan wet market. You'll see it all over India. So that does not exist in Vrindavan. I don't even believe they're allowed to sell eggs. At least, a decade, 2 decades ago, last time I checked, no eggs were publicly sold. In Mathura, I saw eggs being sold, but in Vrindavan proper, they weren't being sold. So Prabhupada said you have to immediately outlaw public meat eating. And it was interesting. He was thinking about a principle that we have, ahimsa, not killing other living entities. And he was thinking about, how far can you go in establishing ahimsa and making a vegetarian or a vegan country? And he was realizing you can't go so far with that. People have to be allowed to eat meat. It's part of, cultures all over the world. So he was saying, okay, at least don't do it publicly. Like if you go to Gujarat, for instance, there's no alcohol sales in Gujarat. So if you drive over the border from Gujarat into Rajasthan, which is a border town, Gujarat and Rajasthan share a border with each other. The moment you drive over the border to Rajasthan, you know what you'll see? Hundreds of liquor shops. Hundreds of them. Because people from Gujarat will go over, they'll buy, and then they'll come back. Same thing in the U.S., in California, it's illegal to sell fireworks. As soon as you drive across the border into Arizona or Nevada, you know what you immediately see? Right on the border. You see fireworks places. And people buy fireworks and come back across the border. But then Gujarat has more cow killing than anywhere else. It's ridiculous how many cows they kill in Gujarat. It's unfathomable. So they have, different states will have different rules. So when Prabhupada had a chance to take the government and influence a politician, the Prime Minister of India, he said no public meat eating. It was one of his rules. I remember this. I can't remember the rest of them. But he said you can't just get rid of it altogether. So sometimes we may have some influence in our community, and we can establish more of our rules, but allow for other people to do their thing, kind of on the down low. Sometimes we might be on the down low, and some other people are ruling. But in general, we need to get along, let people do what they want to do. By the time people are doing something wrong, it's fundamentally wrong, like murder and rape and things like that. You don't have to, it's no longer a minor religious difference. It's a major difference. And you have to rise up against that. And for the most part, as we do not enjoy tremendous political clout, then we do our spirituality as a personal transformation. And we live according to the rules of the state. And if we go to a place where those rules of state are more favorable to us, then hey, that's cool. That's great. But we need to stay away from, and even Prabhupada, when he was given a voice, stayed away from absolute decrees one way or the other. And so I took the thing I thought was, I think the thing, the moral principle that we would want to follow, that I think is the most offensive about modern society and where we differ from modern society, is meat eating. People cause unlimited suffering to 50 billion land animals, several trillion fish every single year. They torture them and kill them for food unnecessarily, poison the planet, poison their bodies, poison their children, kill their ability to be compassionate towards others, kill the golden rule of doing unto others as you have them doing to you, kill their compassion, their ability to empathize with other living entities. It's just a terrible crime against the planet, against life, against sentience. Even in that circumstance, people have always been eating animals. It's there in the Vedas. It's there in all the ancient texts. It's just a part of any civilization. Some people are going to do that, and you can't try to outlaw those things. Does that answer your question? All right. Thank you very much. Let's do some kirtan. Hare Krishna.